The silence after the sale was supposed to bring closure, but instead it carved out a strange quiet inside me, the kind that presses against your ribs when the storm finally passes. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe, really breathe, without waiting for the phone to buzz with another lie or another consequence of a mess I didn't create. But healing isn't a switch you flip. It's more like the settling after an earthquake, walls still trembling, dust still falling, even if the worst part is over. Seattle felt different after everything. Not brighter, not softer, just more honest. The city lights outside my penthouse didn't judge me, didn't rewrite me, didn't shrink me the way my family always had. I returned to my routines, the ones that steadied me: morning strategy reviews, late night coding sessions, quiet dinners eaten standing by the window. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to outrun anyone's expectations. I wasn't building to prove anything. I wasn't striving to be seen. I was simply existing in the life I created. Still, the echoes of that dinner in Portland lingered, the clatter of silverware, the stunned silence after the truth dropped, the way Crystal's voice shook when she said I was ruining everything. Sometimes I replayed it, not from pain but from astonishment. They never saw me. Not really, not who I became, not what I built. And once I stopped needing them to, the world around me opened up in ways I didn't expect. 3 days after the sale finalized, I sat at my office desk long after everyone else had left. The city stretched beneath me, a grid of glowing windows and shifting shadows. My computer screen reflected faintly in the glass lines of code, projections, acquisition plans. Work had always been my refuge, the place where logic replaced emotion and effort produced results. But that night, I found myself staring past the numbers, past the charts, toward a question I had avoided for years. Who am I when I'm not surviving them? The thought unsettled me more than it should have. My identity had been shaped by pushing against boundaries they set around me, being the disappointment, the outsider, the quiet one who didn't fit their image. Now those roles were gone, severed cleanly, and the quiet that followed pressed into me like a new kind of weight. I shut my laptop and stood, stretching my stiff limbs, ready to call it a night. But as I stepped toward the elevator, I realized I wasn't ready to return to the silent spaciousness of my penthouse. Not yet. So instead, I walked through the empty halls of my office, the faint hum of the heating system filling the air. Each room echoed the life I had built, one decision, one risk, one sleepless night at a time. I stopped at the glass doors overlooking the harbor. The water shimmered beneath the city lights, boats anchored like still shadows. A gull cried somewhere in the distance, its voice sharp and lonely. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and felt, for the first time since Portland, something shift inside me. A question uncoiled, quiet but persistent. If I no longer lived in the shadow of their judgment, then what came next? The answer didn't arrive that night, or the next, or the one after that. But what did arrive was something unexpected, an invitation that appeared in my inbox the morning after my late night wandering. It came from a name I hadn't thought about in months. Daniel Hale, the investor who had once offered me a seat at his table back when my company was still climbing. I respected him. He respected me. But timing, then, had been off. Now his email was simple, almost understated. Zoe, if you're open to it, I'd like to discuss something I believe only you can build. It wasn't his words that struck me, it was the timing. I stared at the message for a long moment, aware of something stirring in my chest. Not fear, not hesitation. Something like possibility stretching its limbs. I typed back a single line, send a time. His reply came in minutes. Tomorrow, private suite, Bellevue Tower. When I closed the email, I realized the faint ache that had followed me since Portland had quieted. Not healed, not vanished, but faded enough for something else to take its place: curiosity, direction, a pull toward what came after survival. The next day arrived cold, the kind of cold that settles under your skin, no matter how many layers you wear. I wrapped my coat tighter and stepped into the lobby of Bellevue Tower, its marble floors gleaming, its walls adorned with art that probably cost more than most homes. The elevator ride to the private suite felt strangely symbolic, like rising into a space I had finally earned entry to without needing anyone's permission. When the doors opened, Daniel was already waiting, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He greeted me with a nod, the kind that said he respected my time too much for unnecessary pleasantries. "You look steady," he said. I almost laughed. I've had a month. A month can change someone. It changed more than I expected. He gestured toward the seating area, the skyline spilling in through the floor to ceiling windows. "I've been watching your moves," he said. Quiet, precise, brutal when needed. I arched a brow. "Brutal isn't what I aim for." "No," he said with a small smile. "But you know how to protect what's yours. That's rare." He slid a folder across the table toward me. I didn't touch it yet. He waited. "What is this?" I asked. "An opportunity," he answered. "One that requires someone who knows how to build from nothing. Someone who understands pressure. Someone who doesn't flinch when the ground shifts. Someone who's lived through what you just did." His gaze held mine, steady and knowing. "And I think that someone is you." I finally placed my hand on the folder, feeling the weight of whatever was inside. And as I opened it, a truth settled into me, quiet and sure. My story wasn't closing. It was beginning again. Right there, in that room. With the life I built, not the life they tried to define. And whatever waited inside that folder was going to change everything. Again. Whatever waited inside that folder was going to change everything. Again. The papers inside weren't what I expected. Not a contract. Not a pitch deck filled with glossy charts and exaggerated projections. Instead, it was a blueprint. A problem so big it pulsed off the page like a heartbeat. A fractured system. Millions of frustrated users. A gap wide enough for someone bold enough to step into. And Daniel was looking at me like he already knew my answer. "You've been building alone for a long time, Zoe," he said quietly. "But what you did in Portland, that wasn't the work of someone who hides behind code or silence. That was the work of someone ready to step into something larger." I closed the folder slowly, the gears in my mind already moving faster than my pulse. "What exactly are you asking me to build?" I asked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Expression sharpened with focus. "A system that doesn't exist yet. One that everyone needs but no one's brave enough to attempt. You've built tools. You've built companies. Now I'm asking you to build an empire?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window instead, the skyline stretching like a map of possibilities. Buildings layered over each other, each one built by someone who once stood at a crossroads just like this. "What's the catch?" I asked. His smile was almost amused. "The catch is simple. It requires all of you. Not the version your family tried to shrink. The real you." I hated how that sentence landed, sharp, precise, true. For a brief moment, I saw myself months from now, years from now, standing at the head of something massive, something undeniable, something no one could rewrite or erase. I exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it." Daniel nodded, as if expecting that answer. "Take the weekend. Come back Monday with a yes or no. But whichever you choose, choose it for you." When I left the suite, the air outside felt sharper, the cold slicing clean through the noise in my head. Snow had begun drifting down, thin, soft flakes swirling against the wind. I walked slower than usual, letting the city breathe around me. Building an empire. It sounded dramatic, almost arrogant. But something inside me, something I'd buried under years of dismissal and doubt, flickered awake at the idea. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by silence. The city lights blinked in the distance, reflected faintly on the glass. I opened the folder again, scanning every line, every diagram, every flaw and potential. My mind slipped into the space it knew best, the space where everything else fell away and only the problem remained. I could build this. I could actually build this. But the question that haunted me wasn't whether I could. It was whether I should. My family's absence was a strange relief, no guilt, no pressure, no rewrite of my choices into something ugly or selfish. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't making a decision with their voices in my head. I was making it with mine. Sometime after midnight, I closed the folder, set it aside and leaned back on the couch. My phone buzzed once, a message from Lily. Just wanted to check in. Thinking about you. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't dig. She never needed to. That was the difference between someone who loved you and someone who loved the idea of you. I'm okay. I typed. Then paused. Deleted it. Typed again? I'm building something new. She replied instantly. I can't wait to see it. The words warmed something in me I didn't realize was still cold. Saturday passed quietly. I worked through pieces of the blueprint, mapping out the structure in my head, letting ideas stretch their legs. The more I touched the project, the more it felt like stepping into a version of myself I had always been moving toward without realizing it. Sunday morning, I made coffee and sat on the floor by the window. Snow layered the city in soft white, muffling the usual noise. The silence felt different now, less empty, more intentional. I finally admitted to myself what I'd known since I opened the folder in Daniel's suit. I wasn't afraid of failing. I was afraid of succeeding so fully that there would be no part of me left for the people who once defined my worth. But fear wasn't a good enough reason to stay small. So on Monday, I walked back into Bellevue Tower with a steady breath and a decision already sitting in my chest. Daniel looked up the moment I entered, reading the answer on my face before I spoke. I set the folder on the table. I'll build it? He grinned, not surprised but proud. Good, I expected nothing less. He extended his hand. I shook it. The moment our palms met, the next chapter of my life snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Not because I owed anything to anyone. Not because I needed validation. But because the girl they called a disappointment was about to build something no one else had the courage to attempt. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Contracts, projections, outlines of our roles. The structure was lean, intentional, ambitious. A partnership built on respect, not hierarchy. When I left, the weight in my chest wasn't heaviness. It was purpose. But stepping toward a future doesn't mean the past stays quiet. It rarely does. 3 days into planning, I received a message from an unknown number. At first I thought it was spam. Then I read it twice. Zoe, it's Dad. We need to talk. The air left my lungs, not from fear, not from hope. From the quiet understanding that nothing in my story ever resurfaced without a reason. Before I could decide whether to respond, another message came. It's about Crystal. And just like that, the past I thought I'd buried began to shift beneath my feet again. Not violently, not loudly, but with the slow, inevitable pull of something unresolved rising to the surface. I stared at the screen, the cold clarity returning like an old friend. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. Not yet. I stared at the screen, the cold clarity returning like an old companion. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. Not yet. For a long moment, I didn't move. The city lights flickered against the window, casting shifting patterns across my hands. I thought about ignoring the message, letting it dissolve into the digital void the way they once wished I would dissolve from their lives. But curiosity has a pull, a quiet, stubborn gravity. I typed nothing. Instead, I set the phone down on the counter and let the silence stretch. My father's words, "It's about Crystal," kept echoing, not because I feared for her, but because I didn't know which version of her this message referred to. The golden child? The manipulator? The girl who watched me get thrown out and smiled into her napkin? Or the sister I barely remembered from childhood, the one before favoritism sharpened her edges? An hour passed before I picked the phone back up. I didn't text him. I called. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone in his hand. Zoo. He said my name like an apology and a plea tangled into one. What's going on? I asked, my voice flat, controlled. It's your sister? A shaky breath on the other end. She's not doing well. Not doing well. The phrase was vague enough to be anything emotional, financial, self-inflicted, or simply inconvenient for them. What does that mean? I asked. My father hesitated, the same hesitation he never had when tearing me down, but now stumbled over when asking for something. She hasn't left her apartment in days. She's barely answering calls. And her boutique closing it hit her harder than we expected. There it was, not a cry for help. A dent in the image. You should call a therapist, I said coolly. We tried, he said quickly. She refused. She keeps saying she ruined everything. And she mentioned you. I didn't respond. She said you're the only one who can understand. He paused, then added softly, she said you were the only one who ever saw her. That sentence struck a strange chord, not pain, not sympathy, but recognition. Crystal had always lived under a spotlight so bright it burned. She was shaped for display, not depth, admired, not understood. And for the first time, I wondered if she had ever felt truly known at all. My father's voice cracked. Please? Can you go see her? I leaned against the counter, letting the weight of the request settle. They hadn't called me when they forged my name. They hadn't called when they slandered me. They hadn't called when everything fell apart. But now that their golden child was crumbling, suddenly I mattered. I'll think about it, I said, and ended the call before he could thank me. The apartment fell silent except for the faint hum of the heating vents. I stared out at the skyline, my reflection merging with the glass. Helping Crystal wasn't a question of forgiveness. It was a question of boundaries, of who I was becoming and who I refused to be again. The next morning, Daniel noticed immediately the moment I walked into the office. You look like someone who didn't sleep, he said gently. I didn't elaborate. Family resurfaced. He nodded with the kind of understanding that came from having his own ghosts. You don't owe them anything? I know, I replied. That's why I'm thinking clearer than they expect. Work offered a distraction, structuring the build, planning timelines, mapping out the architecture of something massive, but every so often, the thought of Crystal's name, trembling through my father's voice, crept back in. By noon I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and left without explaining. I didn't need permission. I didn't owe a reason. The drive to Crystal's apartment was quiet. Snow had turned into rain, tapping lightly against the windshield. Her building was newer, slightly upscale. The kind of place curated for Instagram pictures and borrowed confidence. I rode the elevator to the 18th floor. Each floor ticked off like the countdown to something I couldn't define. When the door opened after my third knock, Crystal stood there, nothing like the polished version of herself she always presented. Her eyes were swollen, makeup smudged, hair unbrushed. She looked like someone who'd been fighting shadows and losing. For a moment, all her sharpness dissolved. She stared at me like she wasn't sure I was real. You came, she whispered. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I stepped inside. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn, takeout boxes piled on the counter. Her boutique's awards, plaques, certificates, glossy photos were scattered across the floor as if she'd tried to find comfort in them and failed. She sat on the couch, curling her knees toward her chest. Mom and Dad think I'm dramatic, she said with a brittle laugh. They think I'm embarrassed. But it's more than that. She wiped her nose, voice cracking. I feel like I've been living someone else's life. Like everything I worked for wasn't even mine. I kept borrowing pieces of you, your stability, your credit, your silence. I thought success would make me real. Instead, I feel hollow. She looked at me, eyes shining with something raw. I was jealous of you, she confessed. Not your money. Not your work. Your freedom. You didn't need them. But I did. I still do. That admission, small, broken, unpolished, hit deeper than any insult she'd ever thrown. I sat across from her, not ready to bridge the distance but not willing to widen it. She whispered, Are you angry? I thought about it. Really thought. I said softly, a long time. But right now, I'm just tired. Crystal nodded like she understood something she'd never bothered to see before. The rain outside softened into a steady rhythm, filling the silence between us, washing away the sharp edges of the moment. Finally, she asked the question she'd been circling since I walked in. Can we fix this? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. Healing wasn't a switch. Trust wasn't a reset button. And family wasn't something you stitched back together, just because the pieces finally noticed the seams. So I told her the only honest thing I could. We can try. But not the old way. She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. And for the first time in our lives, we sat in the same room without competing, Without comparison, without pretending. Just two sisters trying to figure out how to rebuild something that never had a solid foundation. I stayed until she fell asleep, curled on the couch like a child finally allowed to stop performing. I covered her with a blanket, turned off the dim lamp, and let myself out quietly. The hallway smelled faintly of pine cleaner, the lights humming soft and low. As I walked toward the elevator, I didn't feel triumphant or guilty or conflicted. I felt free, not because the past was resolved, but because I had stopped running from it. At the elevator, my phone buzzed. Daniel again. "How did it go?" he asked when I answered. I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close.
Honestly, I don't know yet.
He didn't push. Whatever comes next, you don't face it alone. His words settled into me with unexpected warmth. When I returned home, the city lights glowed through the mist like quiet promises. I stood at the window, letting the view anchor me. My family's story wasn't undone. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't rewritten. It was simply shifting, like tectonic plates beneath the surface, slow but unstoppable. And somewhere between the broken pieces of who we were, and the beginnings of who we might become, I realized something I wish I had known years ago. Sometimes the people who hurt you are also the ones who crumble first when the truth finally reaches them. But their collapse does not define your strength. Your healing does. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was finally healing.